Yeah, so tariffs can be a good thing. I'm not saying they're entirely a bad idea, but they're usually meant to correct behavior or correct some inefficiency in the system. You don't have that between the United States and Canada. And certainly, if there's disputes with Mexico and you've heard claims by some that Mexico is a gateway for Chinese goods to be restamped or rebranded and sent up as part of the NAFTA supply chain, we don't want that as well. So I hope that if that's happening, that gets cut off at the knees sooner rather than later.
Welcome to Municipal Affairs. Today we find ourselves at a pivotal crossroads in Canada. For months, United States President Donald Trump has made it clear he intends to impose a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada into the United States. And this past weekend, February 1st, President Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on goods and a 10% tariff on oil and gas products coming from Canada into the United States. Then on Monday, February 3rd, President Trump announced that there would be a 30-day pause on those tariffs. So the tariffs countdown clock begins again. This decision has cast a long shadow across border communities and threatens to disrupt one of the most successful trade relationships in the world. This just isn't about spreadsheets and trade statistics, though. It's about jobs, families, and the livelihoods on both sides of the border. From Windsor to White Rock, the countless towns in between, Canadian mayors are witnessing the ripple effects of uncertainty firsthand, and together they are stepping up. That's why the mayors of border communities across Canada have united as the Borders Mayors Alliance, a national partnership formed to speak with one voice, advocate for our towns, our communities, and our cities, and safeguard the vital bonds of cross border trade. Today, we are joined by Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens, the chair of the Border Mayors Alliance, to discuss the impacts that tariffs may have on the municipalities and how the organization plans to challenge them if they are imposed in March. Mayor Dilkens, thank you so much for doing this. You are the chair of the newly formed Border Mayors Alliance, which spans from BC all the way to New Brunswick, speaking with municipalities, as our show does. This is coming at a time of unprecedented challenges for cross border trade. Why did you believe this was the most appropriate things municipalities should be doing at this time?
Well, I think it's fair to say that mayors in border cities understand the impact of what a tariff would create and the havoc it would cause in our communities. And so we know that our communities, including my own, are going to be hit first and hit the hardest if there were a tariff put in place. And so it was about activating mayors from coast to coast in our country who feel the same way, who want to put Canada first and link arms together, but then also being able to, lend our relationships into the national dialogue as appropriate, because we have relationships with mayors on the other side of the border. And those communities too stand to be impacted very, very negatively if a 25% tariff were applied to Canada. So how do we reach out to the mayors on the other side of the border after we've created our own alliance and be able to amplify their voices and the concerns that they have for their communities as well?
This conversation would be completely different if Donald Trump hadn't done what he had done yesterday, which was put that pause on tariffs for 30 days into March. So what does the Border Alliance do now? Now that the clock is ticking down for another 30 days, what's step one for the alliance? Because many people might be looking at you going, what can municipalities truly do? Because they are the government of proximity, but this isn't traditionally in their purview or jurisdictional purview.
That's right. So this is about advocating collectively and making sure that, from a federal perspective and a provincial perspective, that we're not just talking about the government saying they'll be there to support municipalities and families, but what does that mean? Because there's a lot of folks in our community that yesterday were extremely, extremely afraid that the 25% tariff was going to take hold and they were going to be out of work, within a week. And so it's about really making sure that, again, lending our voices into the national dialogue, but also saying we need some signals from the federal and provincial governments, more than just saying you're going to be there. What does that mean? And get folks back together and have that conversation. And so moving forward, we know that great today we've got this breathing room for 30 days, but we also know that the anvil is still hanging over our head 30 days from now. And then 30 days after that, because you'll recall the first day when the president was inaugurated, he signed an executive order that called for all of his cabinet secretaries to report back to him by April the 1st on issues related to counterfeit goods, currency manipulation, and unfair trade practices, which, he indicated at the time was about Canada, Mexico, and China. A lot of us would look at that and say, we don't really have currency manipulation in Canada. That probably is a spotlight shined on China, but I take nothing for granted with Donald Trump. And certainly the uncertainty that is out there because of these types of issues creates confusion and concern in our communities.
What are you hearing from your neighboring United States partners? Because I'm assuming with your proximity to Detroit, you're in constant contact with the Detroit mayor. What are you hearing from your US counterparts to help you understand what's going on down south of the border?
Yeah, and so I spoke with the mayor of Detroit yesterday, but there's also mayors in Dearborn, which is like 15 minutes away from here, Sterling Heights, where there's another manufacturing facility. There's all sorts of parts and tool, die, and mold, industries really on both sides of the border. And the best way to describe this is where I'm sitting in my office at City Hall right now. It's literally 1.5 kilometers away to the city of Detroit. I mean, I can see them quite clearly out my window. And what that means is, as Canada's auto capital and Detroit being the motor city, the supply chains in the auto sector have been built up so tightly. They're so highly integrated on both sides of the border that the parts that go back and forth before they go into a vehicle that rolls off the assembly line, whether that's in Windsor or Detroit, have crossed the border about 6 or 7 times. And so it's really impossible to say that a car is made by Americans or by Canadians or by Mexicans because the integration of the supply chain is so tight. And what that means is mayors like me, but also mayors in Detroit and Dearborn and Sterling Heights. And we all understand that a 25% tariff is just really bad for business. It's bad for residents, regardless of which side of the border we live on, that it's just going to increase the price of vehicles, add to inflation, and be bad for the industry. I mean, an increase in the price of a vehicle means a lot of folks are just going to say, you know what, I'm going to wait and see what happens here. I'm going to park my money, which means the OEMs are going to adjust their inventory and they don't have to make as many cars, which means they're going to lay folks off, and that will cascade down the supply chain. And ultimately, it will make its way to Tim Hortons because there will be fewer people buying Tim Hortons coffee. Everyone will be impacted. And so those folks over in Detroit, they understand the issue. Their politics is a little different than our politics. And so they have a tougher road to navigate with respect to messaging and how they can show their support. But in no uncertain terms, those mayors understand and support the position to keep the tariffs off of Canada because it's bad for U.S. business as well.
I know Ontario is currently in the process of going through their own provincial election. Is this an appropriate time to launch this type of alliance? Because people are distracted by politics that are going on in Ontario. And I know most of your members from the alliance are from Ontario. There are a few in Manitoba, a few in Saskatchewan, a lot in BC and New Brunswick. But in Ontario, it seems like people are distracted right now. Is this a good time to do this? And should you be leading it?
I think it's the best time to do it, in fact, because the municipalities are the stability at this point. You have a federal government that's in a bit of disarray as we go through the leadership review with the uncertainty of who the new leader will be. Then there's likely to be some federal election sooner rather than later, we hope, to reset our relationship with the United States. The premier, he called the election. The election will be the end of February. Thankfully, he talked about wanting to get a mandate. The fact that there's still a 30-day period here that now we've got a breathing room, it actually reinforces the whole need to have a mandate because who knows what happens 30 days from now. But the mayors, certainly in Ontario, we're the stability. We're the ones that know our border communities the best. We've come together before, this group of Ontario mayors, certainly we've come together before during COVID when the border was closed and there were impacts in our communities. And we had many meetings with Bill Blair and Marco Mendicino and others during the day to talk about the issues. And so we're quite comfortable working with each other in Ontario, but this was about expanding that and bringing in mayors in border cities across the country who also have the same type of impacts and the same citizens in their communities who care and are concerned. And really linking arms to show a unified front. So we're not trying to take over. We're not zigging when someone else is zagging. We're saying we want to be part of the national dialogue. We want to use our relationships to help feed into the national dialogue. We want to be a resource, not a distraction for the work that's happening.
Now, I've had the pleasure of sitting down with many countless reeves and mayors of small urban communities across the border in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. I know some of them firsthand. You talk about cities. Is this just a city issues, or are you
No.
reaching out to the smaller urban rural communities, the Reeves, to say, let's work together? Just because I'm the city of Windsor and you're the RM of Torquay doesn't mean that we can't work together on this issue.
100%. We welcome, and we have many small municipalities who are part of our alliance. It's not just cities. Many small mayors, because they're communities as well. Even though the scale might be smaller, the impact will be the same. And so we welcome them. We have many who are already on board, and our doors are open. Matter of fact, I had a call yesterday with the mayor of Whitehorse, who you would think, well, is that a border community? Well, in fact, it is. If you look at the geography and the proximity to Alaska, they are a border community, and there will be a negative impact in Whitehorse as it relates to a tariff on Canada. And so he has now, as of yesterday, joined the alliance. He wants his voice to be heard on behalf of his community. So let me be really clear. Any reeve, any small mayor a mayor of a small town, I should say, any city mayor, you want to be part of the Border City Alliance, we welcome you. As long as you are Canada first and you want to make sure that we are rowing in the same direction, that's really the only criteria for your advocacy, is making sure that we're lockstep in the way we approach this and wanting to make sure that there are no tariffs put in place by the United States on our country.
What's next? So we are now 30 days, and we talked about it at the top of the interview, but what do you have to do now? Is it gathering the Mayor's Alliance together and sitting down virtually like we are right now to have discussions to say, this is the best path forward? We need to start reaching out to our neighboring counterparts to say, how can we work together to sort of put this on the national stage? Are you going to be going down with Doug Ford as his delegation to the Council of Federation leaders to the United States later on this month to speak with U.S. representatives? What's next in this step? And are you optimistic that we can get the tariffs put off on March 3rd when they're expected to be back on?
Okay, so you've asked a few questions there. One, I'm not going with Doug Ford to Washington. I appreciate his advocacy, and he has a role to play, and I appreciate all that he's doing. In terms of what's next, for us, again, we're adding more members in Canada, but we're not stopping and waiting until we get to a certain number. We've got over 20 now, and I think that's a real healthy representation across our country. What's next is reaching out across the border and trying to amplify and get to the folks in blue states, in red states, in cities that stand to have a huge impact, just like we will in Canada, to get their mayors, to get their senators, to get their state representatives and their congresspeople and their city councilors activated to add their voice to the chorus to say, listen, it doesn't matter whether you're red or blue here. At the end of the day, a tariff on Canada and a tariff on Mexico will have a detrimental negative impact on residents in my community in the United States.
Can I challenge you on that? Can I challenge you on that for a second? Because
Sure.
Donald Trump says that's not the case, though. President Trump, when you're talking to the American counterparts, you'll probably hear that President Trump says it's a good thing. It's the best word that he's ever heard of. So how do you combat that with the reality that tariffs are bad for both sides of the border? Because it sounds like in the States, when I talk to my American friends and people who do municipal shows as well, they're saying that tariffs are actually good and it needs to be put into place to make the trade between our two countries better.
Yeah, so tariffs can be a good thing. I'm not saying they're entirely a bad idea, but they're usually meant to correct behavior or correct some inefficiency in the system. You don't have that between the United States and Canada. And certainly, if there's disputes with Mexico, and you've heard claims by some that Mexico is a gateway for Chinese goods to be restamped or rebranded and sent up as part of the NAFTA supply chain. We don't want that as well. So I hope that if that's happening, that gets cut off at the knees sooner rather than later. But I think, you can listen to what the president says. I think when it comes to economics, I feel a whole lot more comfortable listening to the entire chorus of economists, including Nobel laureate economists, who talk about the effects of tariffs. I think if you look at the history when tariffs have been applied in the past on a wholesale basis by the United States on some of their trading partners, you saw the outcome. And it's clear that what the effect of tariffs will be to increase inflation in the United States. It will be to increase the value of the US dollar, which means they will sell less goods that they manufacture in the United States. And it will actually have the opposite impact that the president is hoping that it will have. And so there's one thing in my community about buying cars. People can always, you can always put $1,000 into the old clunker and keep it going for another month or two, right? You can park the acquisition of a new car for a period of time, but everyone has to eat. And so I talk about automotive because that is the heart of my city, but literally within 20 minutes in the county, in Essex County that I live in, we have the second largest cluster of greenhouses anywhere in the world, only dwarfed by Holland. Holland has the largest. We're the second largest cluster in the world here. 85% of the products produced in these greenhouses is exported to the United States. Every American has to eat. And I'm telling you, what this means is that the price of cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers will be up by 25% overnight. And that's just the start of it. And so it's bad for business, and we've proven that it's bad for business. And it is hard. It is hard to, out talk the president of the United States. He's got among the biggest pulpits in the world. And there's a group of people who are disciples that believe everything that he says. And sometimes facts don't matter to those folks.
Yeah.
But to the people who actually have to pay the bill, and if this were to take effect, they're going to start paying the bill. They're going to see their costs going up. And you have on one hand where the president has said, tariffs are the best thing in the world. And on the other hand, saying he's going to lower costs and he's going to be, the savior for costs and inflation in the United States. Well, doing this means your costs are going up on the other hand. It will have an equal and opposite impact. And so it'll be interesting to watch. I'm hopeful that brighter minds will prevail 30 days from now and 60 days from now, with the ultimate goal being let's get some certainty in the relationship with our largest trading partner so that everyone knows the rules of engagement going forward. But I hope this is also a domestic wake-up call for Canadians to be able to remove any and all of the interprovincial trade barriers that exist within our country. Let's make sure that we can at least trade amongst ourselves better than we do today. And let's look at what we have to do as a nation to make sure that we are creating the pipelines and the gateways for our resources and our industries to have the most amount of success selling to other parts of the world, so we're not so reliant on the United States. This in some ways could be bad long term for the United States if Canada can figure this out and we find other trading partners that we don't have to rely on the United States. Ultimately, that's bad for the US in the long run.
Final question before I let you go, Mayor, and that is why should municipalities in Western Canada join the alliance? Because it seems like you have a lot, like I said, a lot in BC, a lot in Ontario, but you're slowly gathering support in Western Canada. I talked to many of them. Why should I tell them to join the Border Mayors Alliance to help your cause and sort of speaking with one unified voice?
Yeah, listen, I think we all collectively have a whole lot to lose, and we're certainly going to be stronger together. And that's what this is all about. This is about being stronger together. This is about coming together and sharing the stories of how a tariff is going to impact our respective communities, but also leaning into the relationships. I never take for granted. I mean, that's, my knowledge of mayors and other cities is that they sometimes have the best connections and the best relationships compared to MPs or MPPs. Even when there are ministers around the table, the mayors often have some of the best and strongest relationships. So let's lean into that. Let's use the mayors' relationships across our country to be able to add the voices of mayors on the other side of the border whose communities will be negatively impacted by the provision of a tariff to Canada. And let's grow this chorus of people to say there's got to be another way. Tariffs are not the pathway. If there's friction, let's solve those points of friction and move past that. But let's create certainty that's going to create good paying jobs in all of our countries, on our continent, and ultimately build our economies for the benefit of all of our families.
Mayor Dilkens, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
As Canadian communities brace for the fallout of these U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods, it is clear that the stakes could not be higher for local economies. Municipalities are the backbone of the Canadian economy, the engine that drives growth, productivity, and jobs. That's why the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has been sounding the alarm. FCM President Rebecca Bligh has strongly condemned these tariffs, warning of the severe consequences they will have on local businesses, workers, and the supply chain that powers our communities across Canada. FCM has also been proactive, working hand in hand with federal and provincial partners and engaging with U.S. counterparts like the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. Their message is clear. Local economies on both sides of the border are interconnected, and these tariffs put us all at risk. Now, in a few days, FCM representatives will be joining Ontario Premier Doug Ford in Washington, D.C. as part of the Council of Federation delegation, working to defend Canada's economic interest. And before that, President Bligh and FCM's Big City Mayors Caucus will meet with key federal ministers to ensure Canada's response is both strategic and effective. President Bligh joins us to discuss FCM's effort, what municipalities are doing to mobilize, and how communities, large and small, urban and rural, can navigate these economic uncertainties. Rebecca, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I want to start with kind of the biggest news. We knew it was coming, and on February 1st, Donald Trump, President of the United States, announced that he was imposing a 25% tariffs on all goods coming in from Canada into the United States and a 10% tariffs on energy. This could hurt the economy of Canada, and that means you're members of municipalities across this country. Where does FCM stand on these tariffs today as of recording?
Well, and I do appreciate that question, Chris, very much, because what we know is that municipalities really are that catalyst for growing, prosperous, and sustainable and strong communities across our country, and they're at the front line serving Canadians, particularly in a time of crisis. So a trade war with the US could have major impacts on Canadians and their communities. And what we're seeing is municipalities are rising up as part of that Team Canada effort. And they're doing this just as they always have to protect their communities in times of crisis.
One of the big things that FCM has been proactively working on is about telling the stories about how this trade war could impact municipalities. I know we're recording this at the beginning of the week. Later on this week, you will be meeting alongside the Big City Mayor Caucus with your federal counterparts to talk about the best path forward. What are you hoping to say to the ministers? What are you hoping to hear from the ministers when it comes to the municipalities' role in advocating against this trade war between Canada and the United States?
Well, in any instance that has such broad impacts across local governments and municipalities, we know that the municipal voice is absolutely crucial. And so through FCM, and FCM has a seat at the table, as you've already outlined, through FCM, any negotiations must include local governments, especially where discussions on any tariff impacts or retaliation strategies, any of the direct investments from federal or provincial governments to businesses and communities needs to have FCM's voice at the table. Because as we've already identified, municipalities are at the front lines, and they'll be dealing with the downstream impacts of this economic crisis as it unfolds.
Do you think you're being heard? Do you think FCM is being heard by this government? Because this is a big thing to have FCM part of the discussions now, because I believe FCM delegates are actually going to Washington, D.C. as well later on this month to meet with U.S. representatives about this, along with the Canadian Federation of the Council of Federation Premiers, pardon my French. Do you think FCM is now on the map and actually being taken serious by provincial and federal governments?
I do. And I think that our meeting this week with the Big City Mayor's Caucus, the United Team Canada approach recognizes that we are part of the solution, and we need to be part of the negotiations. And it really does speak to the bigger point that any measures taken that may impact local governments. We've heard discussions, and we're seeing sort of across social media channels, discussions around municipal procurement, and those impacts locally by Canadian. All of this needs to be discussed with FCM, particularly around any potential financial impacts to local governments and their budgets. So FCM is calling for any of those negotiations to be cost neutral for local governments. And the federal government, of course, does and has been a good partner to FCM along the way. And they need to identify that in consultation with municipalities, supportive measures for any local industries and workers needs to have the FCM voice at the table representing municipalities. FCM has been here for Canadians through crisis since 1901, and it's seen, FCM is seen as that critical partner at the table.
It's sort of a broad question. I apologize for throwing it in here, but member communities across the Canada are probably trying to figure out what the steps should be to challenge and push back against these tariffs. And you talk about the Team Canada approach. What is FCM doing to reach out to the members who could be impacted by this trade war? Most important, well, not most importantly, but most prominently, like the border communities along the southern border between Canada and the United States, or because we're such in still early days, we're still in that process of discussing what FCM's role in working with those member communities will be.
Yes, I mean, I think really, Chris, what that question speaks to is the priorities of our members, and we are hearing from our border community members, particularly early on in these discussions, and that support and united approach is spread to all our member municipalities, coast to coast to coast, of every size, of local government, because we know that these tariff impacts will be felt for every Canadian, your neighbors, my neighbors. And so FCM's role here is to stand up, as we always do, to protect the interests of our members and the Canadians that they serve. And I really think that one of the pieces that it really speaks to is sort of the bigger point that we have been advocating for at FCM, particularly around these downstream pressures for municipalities to respond to the demands and the needs during a crisis of their communities, is this new municipal growth framework. Funding municipalities to be able to sustain that growth, to inspire that prosperity, and to build healthy and caring communities for Canadians is our top priority. And so that is the message that we're sending to our members, and that in a time of unexpected volatility, which we're facing now, we have a seat at the table and we are negotiating on behalf of our members.
Just around that fiscal framework before I let you go, because I know we have a time frame here, but the federal budget is going to be tabled sometime in the next few months, depending on if there's an election or if there's not an election. We will see a federal budget. With this ongoing trade war, this means that the economies could be in for some penny pinching. Do you, as president of FCM, feel safe or concerned about the potential impacts this means to that new fiscal framework that FCM has been calling for, not just in the last few months, but last few years?
No, I think that what it really does highlight is our memberships broad support, that is the municipal growth framework is what municipalities and local governments need in order to continue to grow in their communities and serve their residents. So at a time of immense change, and we know that the federal government is going through a lot of changes and sort of uncertainty, let's say right now, the strength of us is to be, at FCM, is to be united and clear and consistently advocating for what's going to make that difference. Yes, we've been in communication with the federal government as this being one of our top priorities in terms of advocacy, and that message won't change no matter what happens in the coming weeks and months as we look into 2025. We know this is what matters to our members, and we stay strong on that point as we advocate to the federal government for municipal finance reform.
Last question. What's your message to your members today? We are in an unprecedented time. Municipalities, as your predecessor or two predecessors ago, Scott Pierce would say, you're the government of proximity. You are the closest to the people. What's your message to the member municipalities across this country today to say, we're with you?
Well, it is exactly that. And Yeah, past President Pierce said it right, that local governments are the government of proximity. We know that when Canadians hit hard times, they are looking for their local governments to respond. Decisions that we make today impact the lives of Canadians tomorrow at the local level. And we see that right across the country. As a Vancouver City Councillor, I see that in the city of Vancouver. Our food programs, our subsidy programs, housing, are all oversubscribed. Canadians need the support of their local governments, and the strength of us as a united group through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is what has us the strongest we can be as we face these challenging times. So, to all of our members of every size, from small communities in rural Alberta to small fishing villages on the Atlantic coast, and every big city and every size in between, FCM is behind you. We are united as one, and we will be fighting the good fight for the benefit of all of the residents that you serve in our country.
President, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about this. I feel like this is probably going to be the first of many conversations we have on this topic. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to do this.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Municipal Affairs. We hope you've enjoyed today's conversation and gained some valuable insights. To stay in the loop with all of our latest episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you're watching this or listening to this or on your favorite streaming platforms. Also, follow us on social media at Cross Border Network. For even more content and learn more about the stories and people we feature on this show, visit us online at crossborderinterviews.ca. Your support means the world to us, so share this episode with your friends and help us keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time here on Municipal Affairs. Till then, everyone.